So as we pour one out for Asus exiting the Android space, I'm left wondering why players keep leaving and what this says about the state of our favourite mobile platform. What problems exist, and is this something that will continue to be an issue? Let's get into it in this video. Do me a solid though, if you love context like this around Android, the industry, Pixel, whatever it happens to be, then do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out more than you know, and I'll see you in future uploads. Cheers. So despite having over 70% of the global market, yes, 70%, Android has this kind of weird situation where some brands are apparently on the ropes. Asus is just the latest casualty and likely won't be the last, as there are definitely problems that Android faces despite the platform's apparent dominance across the globe. So we all remember that HTC and LG, they're probably the biggest and most high-profile casualties in our lifetimes, but from 2017 to 2023, nearly 500, yes, 500 brands exited the smartphone market. You might not remember brands like Kyocera, Meizu, NEC or Micromax, but these are other names that just cut losses and decided that making Android phones and tablets was no longer viable. I'm even counting Huawei as well as one casualty in the broader space, although they still technically exist. The situation is still very different in that there were security concerns, whether founded or unfounded, that's up to you to decide, but since being diminished or almost discarded, Huawei has dropped from being one of the biggest players in the mobile space to arguably a non-entity outside of China to all but the most ardent fans of the brand. The loss of Huawei, I will say, is slightly different from others exiting the smartphone space altogether, and the company does continue to at least try and court Western audiences with impressive hardware, despite many trade embargoes in place. But I think it is another broader discussion for another day regarding Huawei, but an important one to note, as this has drastically affected all of the other players as well, most notably Samsung, as the Korean tech giant's biggest competitor in the space, almost evaporated within just a few months. In this industry though, localized brands naturally come and go, but being a truly global company is actually really tough, and in a very, very crowded marketplace, having something that stands out is difficult when you don't have the financial or R&D muscle to match the likes of Samsung, Oppo, Xiaomi, and more on top of that. Huawei can sort of hang in there, but as I say, it can't quite break free of China. I think brand partnerships won't stop being a thing, but maybe localized versions of our phones will diminish for reasons beyond the control of the people making your smartphone hardware. Before we get into that, I have to say we can't ignore one of the biggest issues that faces our industry, and that is the Apple factor. The reality is that the iPhone is still the most popular individual device sold globally. Apple essentially owns the premium market space in many countries across the globe, and for many Android OEMs, trying to break into that $1,000 plus bracket feels like banging your head against a brick wall. So when you're paying a premium for a device, you kind of expect or have certain expectations for features that they deliver and a certain level of status, which sadly most smaller Android brands maybe can't provide. I disagree there, but lots of people do believe that, sadly, for whatever reason. This is compounded as well by the low end of the market. Android dominates the global volume of sales because of cheap, budget-friendly devices in emerging markets. Personally, I think that's great because I do think Apple's idea of budget is frankly obscene. They're around about $700, I think, for the 16E, but that success at the bottom for Android actually hurts perception of Android phones at the top, conversely, which is really weird to say out loud. It kind of creates this idea that Android is the cheap alternative, making it even harder for brands like Asus or Sony to convince someone that their premium devices are worth over $1,000, especially as they are some of the best phones on the market, but available in lesser regions. Maybe that ship has kind of set sail. Maybe there is a way for brands to lean into this, but it kind of hurts. There's absolutely no doubt about it. To tie into that, heavy UI skins from these smaller brands often leave a sour taste in the mouth of people who use them. They're bloated, they're slow to update, and most of the time, they just sadly lack the polish needed to change public perception of what Android is all about. Ask any Pixel fan why they use a Google smartphone, and usually the reason is that the software is just so much more polished than any other competitor phones, despite Pixels not being the best in terms of hardware across the board. I think that is a major thing that a lot of people forget about. I think personally software actually matters arguably more than hardware in a lot of cases, especially if you get a great experience out of the box and years down the line. And on top of that, if your phone isn't getting updates while a Pixel or Samsung phone is promised 7 years of those, how can you compete there? it costs a fortune in R&D to maintain software for those long periods of time. And if you aren't selling millions of units, the math just doesn't add up, or the maths just doesn't add up. These teams tend to be smaller on these smaller brands, which means leveraging the skills you have available to you elsewhere, which creates this kind of uneven approach to how these phones get released, how they get developed, and how they eventually age and become a problem for someone who's using them. As I say, if you cut costs in the software, for instance, you can cause problems for your brand perception, leading to lower interest, lower sales, and eventually a reason for your brand to have to leave the space, or your fans and buyers to just look elsewhere. I think it's going to be even tougher in 2026 as well. The situation for these smaller brands is only sadly going to get worse. With the massive surge in component demand from AI companies, buying parts and internals is about to get significantly more expensive across the board. For a company like Samsung, they have the scale to potentially absorb some of those costs, but it's likely going to be passed on to us anyway, as I went into detail in a previous video, which you should definitely go check out via the link in the description. But for a smaller player, like let's say, take for instance, Asus, who have left the space most recently, that AI tax could have been a significant burden, one that is just too tough for them to bear. For some of these tiny regional smartphone makers, it could even be the final nail in the coffin for them, especially if budgets and the margins that they have available to them are so razor thin. Put it this way, if you're a smaller OEM and your raw material costs go up by, say, 15%, you either have to raise your prices, making your phone even less competitive against the competition in your price bracket, or you have to take the hit and hope you can sell huge volumes of the product. It is a double-edged sword where the rising tide of tech prices is practically only lifting the biggest ships in the ocean, as it were. It is not all doom and gloom, though. I know I've painted a picture of doom and gloom. While some are leaving, Google is finally starting to get real momentum in this as a premium competitor in the space. For years, the Pixel has been an also-ran, an other in the graphs and the charts of sales. We've craved a good, solid Google phone all across that time, and since the Pixel 9, it actually feels like the glaring faults that were once more really prominent, they're more or less gone. There are a few here and there, and Google can fix those over the next few years. Maybe they can make even more gains. Google is really pushing to convert iPhone people over to Pixel by offering familiar iPhone-like designs that make the switch easy and painless. They're using Gemini as their silver bullet, integrating it so deeply into the OS that it's becoming a reason to buy the phone in and of itself. As I noted though, Google has a distinct advantage because it can decouple these AI updates from the yearly OS cycle, an OS that they develop and put into their own phones, which of course allows them to innovate faster and create something that taps into the hype around Gemini and other AI products while also still maintaining their grip on Android. Ultimately, I think the wider Android landscape is shifting as brands are just flat out saying that enough is enough, but it's also kind of consolidated into a more premium fight between the likes of Google, who are not directly competitors to Samsung, and brands like Samsung. I think while it's sad to see brands like Asus step back, it is more of a symptom of a market that is so mature and frankly getting a lot more expensive to play in. But look, I want to hear from you. I've been a little bit doom and gloom here. You might have a more positive outlook. Are you sad to see that these smaller brands are leaving the space as it does kind of stagnate even more so over the past 4 or 5 years? Or do you think a more focused Android market is actually going to be better for you, the consumer? Drop a comment down below by letting me know what you think. But thanks for watching, and I will speak to you later. Cheers.